This is the first lecture in a three-part series on Poe's ratiocinative tales. The definition of ratiocination is a methodical, logical train of thought, and it's a term Poe himself used to describe the stories covered in this video, The Murders of the Rue Morgue and The Purloined Letter. Other stories one might place in this category, the Mystery of Marie Roget, The Gold Bug, A Descent into the Maelstrom, and ratiocination factors into the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym as well. I'll cover all these stories in later videos. Today, it's Murders in the Rue Morgue and The Purloined Letter. If it seems an overstatement to credit Poe with the invention of detective fiction, the character of Saint-Auguste Dupin is certainly the first professed literary detective, and none can deny the influence he would have on the emergence of mystery writing as a genre. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, whose Sherlock Holmes is still a household name, acknowledged the debt he owed to Poe. When The Murders in the Rue Morgue appeared in 1841, it was an instant success. Dupin was a hero with whom Poe's readers could identify, a man who relies on his native intelligence rather than wealth or power. Astute, logical, unflappable, all to a superlative degree, he addresses the problems of modern urban life, and crime in particular, not as intractable moral or spiritual problems, but rather as social problems capable of practical solutions. Unlike so many of Poe's unreliable, often insane narrators, Dupin is clear-sighted, dispassionate, analytical, and extraordinarily, and one might almost say eerily, sane. Murders in the Rue Morgue appeared in Graham's magazine in the spring of 1841, not long after George Graham hired Poe to edit the magazine. It is the first of three stories featuring the detective Saint-Auguste Dupin. The Purloined Letter appeared over 3 years later in a holiday miscellany called The Gift, and this was the final story in the series. In between Murders in the Rue Morgue and The Purloined Letter, a third Dupin story, The Mystery of Marie Roget, was published in Snowden's Lady's Companion. As you can see from the highlighted title, it was advertised as a sequel to Murders in the Rue Morgue, a clear indication of the sustained popularity of the latter story well over a year after its original publication. Because of some basic similarities between Murders in the Rue Morgue and The Purloined Letter, including several of the same characters, I think it's best to talk about these stories at the same time, which I'll do by focusing on 5 themes and motifs they share in common, starting with the narrator, then next Dupin's analytical method, explained first by distinguishing between fancy and imagination, and later between math and poetry. Then I'm going to talk about games a little bit, and finally the rivalry between Dupin and the entire Parisian police department, but more specifically the prefect of police, Monsieur G. The Murders in the Rue Morgue is one of Poe's most complicated stories, both structurally and stylistically. It begins with a lengthy discourse on the analytic mind, 2.5 pages in the Norton volume, which the narrator presents as a kind of introduction or preface to the story proper, but eventually his companion, Saint-Auguste Dupin, becomes the principal agent and speaker as he guides us through the elaborate solution of the murder mystery. And the story ends not with summary remarks from the narrator, as the beginning of the story might lead one to expect, but with Dupin's disparaging comments on the professional efficacy of the prefect of police, Monsieur G. And I'll return to this passage at the end of this lecture. The Purloined Letter follows a similar narrative trajectory. The story begins with brief expository narration before proceeding with a lengthy dialogue between the narrator, Dupin, and the prefect of police, a conversation that introduces important details of the case until Dupin takes over almost completely, limiting the narrator for the most part to short interrogatories and vapid interjections for the remainder of the tale. But Murders in the Rue Morgue has additional layers of narrative complication. First, there are the two newspaper articles reporting on the murders, both quoted in their entirety by the narrator. The first, under the majuscule front page headline, Extraordinary Murders, provides the gory details of the crime. The second article, printed the next day under the less sensational headline, The Tragedy in the Rue Morgue, reports the testimony of a dozen different witnesses, one of whom, the bank clerk Adolphe Lebon, is later charged with the crime. In these two articles, then, Poe intentionally imitates the terse, compact style of journalistic prose in contrast to the meticulous, circuitous style of Dupin's logic. A second complicating factor is the embedded third-person narrative of the crime, which is based on the confession of the orangutan's original owner, this Maltese sailor, who's baited into revealing himself by a personal ad placed in the newspaper by Dupin. This ad, by the way, printed in italics, is yet another example of embedded writing with its own writing specifications and conventions. With so many layers of storytelling, then, one nested inside the other, just even a slight moment of inattention can easily cause the reader to miss crucial signposts and become disoriented. As I said earlier, in both stories, the unnamed narrator gradually fades in the brilliance of Dupin's charismatic voice and elaborate reasoning. He's a kind of shadow of Dupin, but also a surrogate for Poe's reader. When the narrator's astonished, we're supposed to feel astonishment too. His confusion registers our confusion. He asks the questions that we ourselves might ask if we were sitting with them talking about the case. The narrator's relationship with Dupin is unusual. They're strangers at first, but quickly develop a friendship and become roommates. But it's a relationship not unlike character pairings in other stories that we've read. The most striking resemblance, I believe, is to The Fall of the House of Usher. In that story, remember, the narrator stays in Roderick's decayed ancestral home, isolated from the outside world, and deeply involved in his friend's morbid intellectual fascinations. Similarly, in Murders in the Rue Morgue, the narrator and Dupin are constant companions and share a dilapidated house that's rumored to be haunted. The passage I'm going to read now is on the right side of your screen. It was at length arranged, he informs the reader, that we should live together during my stay in the city, and as my worldly expenses were somewhat less embarrassed than his own, I was permitted to be at the expense of renting and furnishing in a style which suited the rather fantastic gloom of our common temper, a time-eaten and grotesque mansion, long deserted through superstition, into which we did not inquire, and tottering to its fall in a retired and desolate portion of the Faubourg Saint-Germain. Had the routine of our life at this place been known to the world, we should have been regarded as madmen, although perhaps as madmen of a harmless nature. Our seclusion was perfect. We admitted no visitors. Indeed, the locality of our retirement had been carefully kept a secret from my own former associates, and it had been many years since Dupin had ceased to know or be known in Paris. We existed within ourselves alone. Then there's the strong influence Dupin has over the narrator, which in certain respects resembles the effect of Roderick Usher's madness on the narrator in the earlier story, to the point that we can no longer trust that the narrator's perceptions align with reality. Dupin is not mad, of course, but the narrator does suggest that his uncanny analytic ability is, and I'm quoting, the result of an excited or perhaps of a diseased intelligence. Even more important is the impact of this intelligence on the narrator himself. I felt my soul enkindled within me by the wild fervor and the vivid freshness of Dupin's imagination. This statement has a corollary in The Fall of the House of Usher. It was no wonder that Roderick's condition terrified, that it infected me, that narrator tells us. I felt creeping upon me by slow yet certain degrees the wild influences of his own fantastic yet impressive superstitions. Inevitably, then, the narrator conforms to the eccentric habits and pursuits of the charismatic Dupin. It was a freak of fancy in my friend, he says, to be enamored of the night for her own sake. And into this bizarrerie, as into all his others, I quietly fell, giving myself up to his wild whims with a perfect abandon. On the surface, Murders in the Rue Morgue and The Purloined Letter are mystery stories. Who killed Madame L'Espanaye and her daughter Camille? If money wasn't the motive, what was? And where did the Minister D conceal the stolen letter? In the competing investigations into these mysteries, the bungling police investigations on the one hand, and Dupin's independent analyses on the other, create tension, low-grade suspense, and occasionally wry humor. But at their core, these are stories about thinking. They're about the analytic mind. What Dupin does matters less than the method behind what he does. In fact, he really does very little. It's easy to forget, for example, that at one point in Murders in the Rue Morgue, he actually draws a pistol on the sailor, but then immediately sets it down on a table and it's never mentioned again. In The Purloined Letter, he delegates gunplay to an unnamed hired man who discharges a musket outside the minister's window to create a diversion for the letter swap. Dupin's firepower is all mental. To explain his unusual successes as an investigator, one must first comprehend his method of analysis, the properties that distinguish it from less capable modes of inquiry. In Murders in the Rue Morgue, this method is elucidated through a distinction between fancy and imagination. Fancy, as the narrator explains, is a constructive or combining power. While capable of observing and documenting facts, fancy can only interpret and organize them according to rules acquired through past experience and recalled through memory. Fancy deals only with what is already known. It cannot create anything new. Imagination, on the other hand, is inventive. The imaginative thinker can combine and synthesize facts to create something novel, unexpected, or surprising. The reason the police cannot solve the murders, according to Dupin, is that they cannot square the bizarre, or as he puts it, excessively outré facts of the case with their previous investigative experience. But it is by these deviations from the plane of the ordinary, he tells us, that reason feels its way in its search for the true. In investigations such as we are now pursuing, it should not be so much asked, what has occurred, as what has occurred that has never occurred before. What the police investigators lack then, and what Dupin himself apparently possesses in abundance, is imagination. The analytical mind, then, can make connections that extend beyond established fixities. The police err by being too fine, too precious in their observations. By focusing only on what's right under their noses, they cannot see or imagine the bigger picture. Dupin gives the historical example of François-Eugène Vidocq, the French minister of police under Napoleon, whom Poe had previously encountered in his reading of a series of fictionalized accounts published in Burton's Gentleman's Magazine in 1838 and 1839. According to Dupin, Vidocq was a good guesser and a persevering man, but without educated thought, he erred continually by the very intensity of his investigations. He impaired his vision by holding the object too close. He might see perhaps one or two points with unusual clearness, but in so doing he necessarily lost sight of the matter as a whole. The imaginative thinker Dupin applies here is not constrained by direct observation alone. Sometimes one must look sideways to see the full picture. Dupin elaborates on this idea with an analogy to astronomical observation, which again I'll put up on the screen to the right. The modes and sources of this kind of error, that is, the error of Monsieur G and Vidocq, are well typified in the contemplation of the heavenly bodies. To look at a star by glances, to view it in a sidelong way by turning toward it the exterior portions of the retina, more susceptible of feeble impressions of light than the interior, is to behold the star distinctly, is to have the best appreciation of its luster, a luster which grows dim just in proportion as we turn our vision fully upon it. A greater number of rays actually fall upon the eye in the latter case, but in the former there is the more refined capacity for comprehension. By undue profundity, we perplex and enfeeble thought, and it is possible to make even Venus herself vanish from the firmament by a scrutiny too sustained, too concentrated, or too direct. The distinction between fancy and imagination carries over into the Purloined Letter, where the binary terms are switched to math and poetry, but the basic idea is much the same. The mathematics are the science of form and quantity. Mathematical reasoning is merely logic applied to observation upon form and quantity. The great error lies in supposing that even the truths of what is called pure algebra are abstract or general truths. Mathematical axioms are not axioms of general truth. What is true of relation, of form and quantity, is often grossly false in regard to morals, for example. In this latter science, it is very usually untrue that the aggregated parts are equal to the whole. There are numerous mathematical truths which are only truths within the limits of relation. But the mathematician argues from his finite truths through habit as if they were of an absolutely general applicability, as the world indeed imagines them to be. So math then, according to Dupin, deals only with fixities. Its operations are quantification and calculation according to established rules and formulae. Its outcomes are consistent and predictable. 1 plus 1 can only equal 2, and so forth. The poetic thinker, however, relies more on his imagination and is comfortable deviating from established norms and expectations, which according to Dupin is what gives Minister D, an acknowledged poet, the advantage over the prefect of police, who is a mathematical thinker, mistakenly assumes that all poets are fools. As Dupin explains, had the Purloined Letter been hidden anywhere within the limits of the prefect's examination, in other words, had the principle of its concealment been comprehended within the principles of the prefect, its discovery would have been a matter altogether beyond question. This functionary, and that's a pejorative word, this functionary, however, has been thoroughly mystified, and the remote source of his defeat lies in the supposition that the minister is a fool because he has acquired renown as a poet. As Dupin demonstrates, the minister of course is no fool, at least not foolish enough to be outwitted by the police. Knowing that the mind of his adversary would imperatively lead him to despise all the ordinary nooks of concealment, Dupin continues, he could not, I reflected, be so weak as not to see that the most intricate and remote recess of his hotel would be as open as his commonest closets to the eyes, to the probes, to the gimlets, and to the microscopes of the prefect. I saw, in fine, that he would be driven, as a matter of course, to simplicity, so that to conceal this letter, the minister had resorted to the comprehensive and sagacious expedient of not attempting to conceal it at all. Another important passage elaborates on this central theme by building an analogy between physics, concerned with understanding the physical world through direct observation, and metaphysics, which is concerned more with moral truths that are not observable, quantifiable, or measurable, like the nature of love, for instance, or evil. The material world, Dupin says, abounds with very strict analogies to the immaterial, and thus some color of truth has been given to the rhetorical dogma that metaphor or simile may be made to strengthen an argument as well as to embellish a description. The principle of the vis inertiae, that's Newton's first law of motion, for example, seems to be identical in physics and metaphysics. It is not more true in the former, that is in physics, that a large body is with more difficulty set in motion than a smaller one, and that its subsequent momentum is commensurate with this difficulty, than it is in the latter, that is in metaphysics, that intellects of the vaster capacity, while more forcible, more constant, and more eventful in their movements than those of inferior grade, are yet the less readily moved, and more embarrassed and full of hesitation in the first few steps of their progress. What Dupin suggests here is that the material world, that is, the world with which mathematics is primarily concerned, may help us to understand truths that lie beyond observation and sensory experience, but doing so requires a different kind of logic and even a different kind of language. In other words, we must exercise the faculties of creativity, of imagination. Poetical language, then, the invention of similes and metaphors, as opposed to strictly literal or applied language, allows us to reach truths that exceed mere mathematical reasoning. In this passage, he uses an analogy to physics to explain the sluggishness of Monsieur G's thinking, but elsewhere he uses games, the rules of games, and gaming strategy to explain the analytical mind. And with that, we'll move on now to the topic of games. Both the narrator and Dupin use analogies to familiar household games to elaborate Poe's theory of the analytical mind, to show that imagination, poetically enhanced logic, has an unassailable advantage over narrowly prosaic mathematical thinking. In Murders in the Rue Morgue, the narrator uses checkers as opposed to chess, and whist. If you haven't heard of it before, whist is a card game similar to trick-taking games like spades or hearts. In the Purloined Letter, Dupin presents two more gaming analogies, first to the playground game of even and odd, and then a cartographical version of I Spy. I'm not going to elaborate or comment on these analogies here because we'll be using them as a starting point for class discussion. For now, you just need to know what the games are and the page numbers where they can be found. Which brings us to the final topic of this lecture, Dupin versus Monsieur G. The foil to Dupin's analytical investigations into the L'Espanaye murders and the Purloined Letter is, of course, the Parisian police department headed by the prefect, Monsieur G. It is a lack of imagination that hinders their investigation. As we discussed earlier, they rely too much on what they already know to try to make sense of things they've never encountered before. The prefect, the narrator tells us, had a fashion of calling everything odd that was beyond his comprehension, and thus lived amid an absolute legion of oddities. His bureau is baffled by the strange, seemingly inexplicable details of the crime, the condition and placement of the victims, the absence of any obvious means of egress from the fourth floor apartment, and so forth. They quantify the voices heard by the various witnesses, but mathematical thinking prevents them from realizing what seems patently obvious to Dupin, that although there were two voices, one of them was not human. 1 + 1 does not equal 2. The Parisian police, Dupin explains, so much extolled for acumen, are cunning, but no more. There is no method in their proceedings beyond the method of the moment. They make a vast parade of measures, but not unfrequently these are ill-adapted to the objects proposed. The results attained by them are not unfrequently surprising, but for the most part are brought about by simple diligence and activity. When these qualities are unavailing, their schemes fail. This ineffectual diligence and activity is taken to extremes in the Purloined Letter. Speaking of the prefect's meticulous, painstaking search of the minister's person, as well as inside and outside his residence, Dupin says they lacked imagination. They consider only their own ideas of ingenuity, and in searching for anything hidden, advert only to the modes in which they would have hidden it. Thus, he continues, even though the investigative measures adopted, and he's talking about the probing of furniture cushions with needles, the percussing of table legs and bedposts, the inspection of book bindings and paving stones with magnifying glasses, even though these measures, he says, were not only the best of their kind, but carried out to absolute perfection, their defect lay in their being inapplicable to the case and to the man. The prefect, Monsieur G, exasperated by his inability to recover the stolen letter, at one point confides to Dupin, I fancy, notice the word fancy here, I fancy that I have investigated every nook and corner of the premises in which it is possible that the paper can be concealed. What the prefect lacks, of course, is imagination, and Dupin advises him, perhaps it is the very simplicity of the thing which puts you at fault. Perhaps the mystery is a little too plain. At the end of Murders in the Rue Morgue, Dupin disparages the prefect as all head and no body, like the pictures of the goddess Laverna, or at best, all head and shoulders, like a codfish. The implication here being that Monsieur G is confined to the narrow chambers of his own mind, transfixed by rules that govern his understanding of the world and of crime in particular, incapable of imagining anything alien to his own experience or beyond his immediate field of vision. I prefer the image of the flounder to Dupin's codfish. By the time it reaches adulthood, a flounder's eyes are on the same side of its head. It looks in one direction only. It's a bottom feeder, too, dwelling in the murky depths, immersed in a legion of oddities it cannot comprehend, seeking its sustenance in every nook and corner rather than close to the surface where the open water is clear and suffused with light. And of course, the word flounder is also a verb that means to struggle, to sink, to fail. I don't know what kind of sea creature Dupin would be. Something intelligent, of course. Maybe an octopus?